Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be giving a little bit of an introduction to some of the work we've been doing, and then I'll let Katherine actually get into more of the interesting information. So most of what I'm going to be presenting is the background and context. So one of the starting points is invasion and understanding where invasion comes from. And there's a lot of theories of different plants, how they function, why they invade, and we don't necessarily always know exactly what drives invasion, why is it happening, and there's a lot of different ways that this can happen. So passenger versus driver models, where is the plant just more competitive driving change and changing the ecosystem, or is it just filling into empty niches that are already there? These are really important if we're going to learn how to control species. We need to understand why they're showing up and what's happening. And some of them, novel weapons, empty niches. Sometimes weeds are just simply more competitive. We've bred them agronomically. We've done things that have created something that's just more competitive. And then you have things like enemy release, where they're adapted in one part of the world and have a lot of different diseases and insects attacking them, and they're released from that here and become more competitive, while the native species aren't. So keeping the context of, as we're trying to understand these species, we need to understand where we're going, where we're coming from, and try to get the grasp of this, and that allows us to be more effective at controlling them and preventing invasion in the future. So I'm going to present some data on work that I've done on the Milk River Natural Area, Kennedy-Coulee Ecological Reserve. So this is an area right where the Milk River enters back into the United States. And it's a really unique area. And we've seen progress of no annual bromes to significant annual brome coverage occurring over the past 30 years. And at rates that when you're doing the monitoring every few years and you come back 5 years later and you see completely different ecosystems and communities showing up, it is shocking to the system to see how fast these plants are moving. So, and the control can be very expensive for these programs. Historically, annual bromes has been pulling, things like that. And I know one pipeline that spent over $1 million in the neighborhood of 2-3 years just on a mechanical pulling program. So it's the problem of they reseed so quickly in our ecosystem that we just can't keep ahead of them. There's three main culprits that we're seeing here. Japanese brome, cheatgrass or downy brome, Bromus sclerosa is the other one, and Japanese brome, Japonicus and sclerosa look very, very similar. So we've a lot of debates of how much of each one we actually have at times. From Eurasia, annuals and winter annuals, and they can outcompete through forming dense stands. And the problem with them is they set seed in a 3 to 4 week period. So we're finding here that we can have 4 to 6 seed sets in a growing season. So if you're not controlling continually, they just keep expanding. And that becomes the problem with fires, that they become something that they can reproduce and expand much faster than our native species. So there's a survey methodology we used. I'm not going to read all of this, but the basic gist of what we're doing is we set up a grid system and we move back and forth at a spacing usually 100 meters apart or 50 to 100 meters apart for most of our grid spacings. And we would actually map the weeds as we encounter them on that grid through the entire natural area. This allowed us to actually get a snapshot. It's not 100% visitation, but a high enough percentage because you can see the patches 50 meters out from you because they do show up on the grassland. So we're getting a grasp of how dense the patches are and how frequently they're on the landscape. From here, we choose our different densities. And I can share the PDF of this document if you want to see the exact protocol, because I'm seeing that it looked good on my computer, but that's almost invisible now to see. So, but yeah, we have an idea from full detailed survey down to reconnaissance and exploration. We run the grid lines. This is over Kennedy-Coulee, what the grid lines look like, and we'd be going back and forth on each of these lines mapping the weeds. Milk River Natural Area, there's the lines for the natural area that we surveyed. The technique we use is rapid. We're talking 1 to 2 days for each of these properties for a team of 2 to do the survey. So it's a fairly rapid crossing of the landscape. And we do use ATVs when we're doing this. That helps with the rapid, because you could be going 300-400 meters and no weeds at times. And then you hit points where there's tons of them. What we assess, density, so it looks at what the density of stems in a patch are, the percent cover in a patch, and then distribution within the patch. So a patch might be grouping a bunch of small little patches together, or it might be a single individual and that's it. So we have different ways to distribute and assess what's happening. We move through the patches and we'll either collect them as individual spots, or we'll do a start and a stop point and then assess it as a line. So along the linear line, say it's 100 meters long with even distribution of small patches totaling a 2% cover. So you get a pretty rapid cover of the footprint. What we found, this is done 10 years apart. I think the key takeaways is right here. Bromes tectorum, 5,612% increase over a 10-year period. So that is like the Japanese brome didn't move that much, but you start seeing that, and we tracked a lot of other weeds. So when we're doing this, we're tracking all the non-native species. And you can see some of these, we got some really nice drops. One thing that happened on Kenny Coulee when we did this, there was a wildfire that came through and it actually wiped out a number of the weeds completely. So we were not encountering them next time through. That didn't happen for the annual bromes. The Japanese brome got a little bit more stalled by it, but our cheatgrass definitely took off over that period of time. So Milk River Natural Area, this is a grazed area, so Kenny Coulee is non-grazed, and the fire was quite hot there. It actually set back the cheatgrass and Japanese brome because it was so hot. It was burning out the seed bank, burned down into mineral soil. We lost, I think the year I came after the fire and surveyed it, it was just flicksweed. There was not a perennial plant on the landscape. And then we came back 2 years later and it was beautifully needle grass again. It looked, so everything came back. But when we're looking at these rapid inventories, on the natural area, we had similar types of effects happening. So you can see here, percent area infestation, percent of that area that's 100% covered by the weeds. And then we look down in the Milk River, we've got a lot lower percentages in the grazed area. So grazing combined with the fire did have some impacts. When we split out the burned to non-burned areas, we were able to start seeing no burn, 43%, 25% of the area in the burned area was covered, 9%. So we're seeing the fire, when you have one hot fire, had a suppressive effect. The problem is, over the next few years, those annual bromes are setting seed every 3-4 weeks, and so they're going to start accumulating. If there's any bare soil left, they're going to be rapidly increasing over the next few years as they keep expanding outward. So the speed of invasion, this is a landscape, I don't remember when I grew up doing the surveys in the 90s, seeing any cheatgrass at all in the landscape. So we're talking last 20 years of expansions from almost nothing. It came on the US border right off the cropland on the border, and we could watch it in waves moving off the cropland across the Kenny Coulee and Milk River Natural Area. Now has crossed all the way across the entire property and is moving into the Pinhorn to the north. So it's moving very quickly, and the densest populations are usually in the south areas, and they're starting to show up everywhere now. So it is showing up everywhere, and a significant challenge. So light grazing has seemed to have a benefit. We have seen some benefit from well-controlled light grazing. We did some limited grazing in Kenny Coulee, but the fire kind of wiped out a lot of our treatments that we couldn't do the best comparisons on it. But The wildfire definitely showed a picture that it's not always negative, depending on what type of wildfire we're talking about. Repeated fires, I would be afraid, would reverse that. Introducing Rejuvera, this is going to be released in this spring, I believe, is the herbicides. Yeah, it's approved for release this coming spring. Indaziflam has been under Esplanade, available as an industrial herbicide for a while, so there's been lots of trialing going on. It's non-selective. It will kill anything, but it only attacks basically the root buds coming out of the seed. So it sits on the soil and kills seedlings as they're germinating. It doesn't affect the perennial plants. So why they're actually releasing it on, and they've used it in the US quite a bit, and it is very effective on killing annuals as they're coming up, as long as you've got a solid perennial base of native plants that can then fill in the gaps once the annuals are gone. So something that is quite effective. It's been getting a lot of testing, residual, somewhere around 3 years, depending on your soils. That can range based on your soils, which is also nice because something that tries to germinate continually, you're going to deplete the seed bank because it continually has bare soil and it keeps germinating and dying. So you'll deplete your seed bank fairly rapidly. So very interesting herbicide. It is becoming quite popular. I've seen some game-changing pictures of what it's done in the States for fence line contrasts. So it is something that we're highly recommending for different uses. And spot spraying is one of the big things. And then it can be used into your reclamation process. And the other thing is, once you put it down, if everything dies from wildfire, you got bare ground. So be paying attention to how you use it. So this is a herbicide, you don't just send it out, people just use it. You have to be thinking through the process as you're using it. Okay, that is all I have for my presentation, so we'll switch it over. And leading in is Katherine, and she'll be talking about her master's thesis, integrating herbicide and fire with.
Thanks, Steve. So yeah, this is my master's project about prescribed fire and herbicide. Now we're going. So first, I'm just going to very briefly introduce the area that I'm studying in. It is actually in southern BC. So YFN is what I'm going to be focused on today. That's Yakutak Nucleate Reserve. It's natural disturbance type 4. So it's a historical burn interval between 25 and 50 years, but often a lot shorter. So in some areas, it's 2 years. This has created a mosaic of grassland, shrubland, and forest, and it's all very important large ungulate habitat. It's a little bit more about the climate for this zone. It's the IDF XX2 biogeoclimatic subzone. And we see open savanna-like forest, a lot of lodgepole pine. When our grasslands are in good condition, you'll see a lot of rough fescue, Idaho fescue, blue bunch wheatgrass. After some disturbance, you'll often see a lot more June grass, Kentucky bluegrass, and various needle grasses. So problem, as Stephen mentioned, fire can sometimes create a positive feedback loop. So we love to be using prescribed burns to maintain these savannas, but we're worried that the weeds are going to start to take over. The Bromes species in particular have a positive relationship with fire. There's a couple other major weeds of concern on reserve, and those are sulfur cinquefoil and St. John's wort. We aren't totally sure what their relationship with fire is. There's some evidence maybe sulfur cinquefoil benefits more from a fall fire than a spring fire, but in this area, we're not totally sure yet. So this is the broadleaf weed of concern, one of the main ones. It's a perennial native to Eurasia and North Africa, very similar in location to the annual Bromes. Probably introduced around the 1800s, and it reproduces from the base after disturbance. So obviously after a fire, it can come back pretty easily. Again, we're not totally sure whether it's harmed by burning, but it is totally avoided by grazing animals. They want nothing to do with it. It must taste really bad. St. John's wort, Hypericum perforatum, is our other main broadleaf. Again, similar, introduced in the 1800s from Eurasia. It grows in dense patches and outcompetes the native vegetation. and it has very deep roots and vegetative growth, so it can resprout after fire, but it also creates a lot of seeds. And the annual grasses, which I'll kind of skim past, and Stephen already did a good job of covering them. Yeah, they form dense stands. The stands we're seeing on reserve are not super dense yet, but in areas they are getting there. So what has been done on this particular project? We did spraying in 2024 at 2 different times. We did a prescribed burn in 2025 and monitoring in 2024 before any treatments at all, and will be continuing for the next couple of years. Our sites look kind of like this. There's 4 of these on reserve. They're pretty large. Each of those squares you see is 6 meters by 6 meters. The burn goes through those gray boxes in the center, and then the herbicide treatments are applied randomly through the whole area. So yeah, we've got 32 of those 6 by 6 plots per site, and we assess cover in a 50 by 50 centimeter quadrat. The 1 by 1 we just used for counting invasives. We were going to use it to assess shrub cover, but I think I found 2 roses in the entire area, so we didn't assess shrubs. Yeah, so we're doing foliar cover, just percent cover of the species. This is some details on our spray if anyone's interested. We've sprayed the broadleaf, so that's Reclaim, in July, and then Rejuvra, our pre-emergent, in September. Yeah, the details on the sprayer and the rates, if anybody knows a lot about sprays, it's just label rates. We didn't do anything crazy here. There's no different amounts. So Reclaim, this is our broadleaf, which I will talk about a little bit just because Steve didn't have time to cover it. It's a group 4 herbicide. It's selective, so it shouldn't harm grasses, and it's post-emergent, so it has to be applied while the plants are actively growing. It's been designed for control in rangelands and pastures, and the residual is up to 24 months. I've heard it can go a little bit longer, but you're pretty much looking at 2 years of residual effects. Rejuvra, as Stephen discussed, controls emerging weeds and only operates in the very top layer of the soil. So the burn, BC Wildfire, and the Grasmere Fire Brigade helped us out with this in April of 2025. And they just took drip torches out and really precisely burned a pretty small area in the center of the plots. The burn intensity was not super high. It looks in this picture like it did a lot of damage, but everything came back really nicely after the burn. So this was the day of the fire. Most of those dark areas you see are Stipa comata, or needle and thread grass, which burned off really nicely. And yeah, you can't see it very well on the screen, but there's a lot of green patches, and that's actually the Potentilla recta, which we thought at first didn't die at all because it stayed bright green after the fire. But a few weeks later, we were seeing it start to shrivel up. So I've just got some really early results. What we were seeing is burning and herbicide application both affected the vegetation, and that's native and invasive. The pre-emergent alone didn't have a lot of effect on either the perennial or the annual native or invasive species. We might see more of those effects in year 2. But pre-emergent combined with broadleaf herbicides seem to reduce the annuals and the perennial invasive species by quite a bit. We'll see when we get to the graphs. Sometimes the difference was pretty dramatic, which is unexpected, since the broadleaf shouldn't be affecting those annual grasses. So I've just got a couple quick overviews of the community. So this is before we did any treatments at all. And what I want you to notice here is all the bars are quite even. And this is after treatment. So this is after burning and herbicide, and those bars are a lot more uneven. So we can see we're seeing effects on species. This is a little bit more detailed. Our bunch grasses, pretty much we saw they declined after burning. So that is the 4 bars on the left side, but they weren't affected much by any of the herbicide treatments. They just kept doing their thing. So the red bars are 2024, the blue bars are 2025. colors are the same on that screen. And the leftmost four are the burn treatments, and the rightmost are the unburned. The pre-emergent, yeah, you can read it, is signalized by PE. The combination is BP, and the control is CO. Our forbs, we saw quite a bit of difference. They were affected by the broadleaf herbicides, but not by the pre-emergents. So in the plots where we just sprayed pre-emergent or where we had no herbicides applied at all, they were either the same or they went up a little bit. But pretty much where we applied a broadleaf herbicide, whether it was by itself or with a pre-emergent, the forbs just plummeted. And that was regardless of burn. So the burn didn't seem to affect the forbs a whole lot. This is our Bromes cover. And what we can see here, it seemed to decline after the burn, so that's similar to what Stephen was saying he saw, which would be good news. But it was not affected by the broadleaf herbicide applied alone. When we saw the burn combined with the broadleaf herbicide and the pre-emergent herbicide, well, I've been at the sites and I can tell you it looked a little bit like a moonscape. There's pretty much nothing growing at all. But looking at this, so the second from the left graph and then the UBP, it seems like the combination of herbicides made the Bromes decline quite a bit more than pre-emergent alone. This is our cover of Potentilla recta, so that's our invasive cinquefoil, and more or less what we expected to see. It was affected by the broadleaf herbicides, but didn't care what you did with pre-emergent herbicides, and it didn't seem to care much about the burn. Burned, unburned was roughly the same. And Hypericum perforatum, we didn't have super high cover of this in our study sites, but more or less we're seeing if you sprayed it with a broadleaf herbicide, it disappeared. If you sprayed it with a pre-emergent herbicide, it didn't care. And if you put them both together, it disappeared altogether. And didn't really seem to care a lot about the burn. You can see that one high red bar, even that one, where there was a lot of Hypericum perforatum. After the broadleaf was applied, it disappeared. So a little bit of discussion. The pre-emergent alone didn't have the effect we necessarily would have liked to see on the annual brome species. There was greater decline when it was combined with the broadleaf. So when that Reclaim and Rejuva were put together, the annual brome suffered more. Good news, we didn't see significant increases in bromes after burning. So if that pattern continues next year, that's good news for anybody who wants to be doing prescribed burns in the area. We could see more results in year 3, we'll see, especially in those plots where the burn really impacted the native cover. The bare ground could be ideal breeding ground for more bromes. The native plant communities, especially the forbs, were impacted by the burning and the herbicide application. They were not really impacted by the pre-emergence. So I'd say that's good news. If you apply this Rejuva, probably you won't harm your forbs. The problem is we didn't see a whole lot of declines in brome either. So it seems like the best treatment to get rid of invasives would be the broadleaf combined with the pre-emergent. Unfortunately, then you're going to do real damage to your native forbs. And that's where you have to look at the trade-off, because if you have your native, or if your invasive bromes take off and choke out your native forbs, you're not going to have any native forbs anyway. And these are just some acknowledgements. Yeah, the reserve has been super great and super helpful, and so has the University of Alberta. I would just like to acknowledge this is a sister project, so we also are doing a study at Kickaman Creek Provincial Park. That one does not include Rejuva because it has very few annual bromes, but a lot of the survey methodologies were developed there and transferred to Yakutat. So it's another project in progress with similar invasive species and prescribed burning, and at some point you might hear about the results from that as well. Yeah. And here's just some references. Very small. You aren't allowed to see my references.